My daughter called me on a Tuesday evening, and I knew from the first second something was wrong. She never called on weekdays. She texted short, clipped messages. At work, talk later or dinner Friday. The way children do when they've grown up and gotten busy and assume you'll always be there when they finally have a moment. So when my phone lit up with her name at 6:43 in the evening, I set down my coffee and picked up before the second ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "Mom, I'm outside." I went to the front door, and there she was, standing on my porch in the November cold. My daughter Harriet, 34 years old, still wearing her work clothes, the navy blazer she'd had since her first real job, now slightly too big on her because she'd lost weight this past year. She was holding a single rolling suitcase and a canvas bag with the handle of her laptop poking out of the top. Her eyes were dry. That was the thing I noticed first. She wasn't crying. She looked like someone who had already used up every tear she had and was now just standing there, hollow, waiting for someone to tell her what to do next. I stepped aside without saying a word. She came in. She set the suitcase against the wall, the same wall where I used to hang her school photos, and she sat down at the kitchen table and she said, "He changed the locks. I came home from work and my key didn't fit, and there was a note taped to the door from his mother saying the property is under legal review and I should contact their attorney." I sat down across from her. I asked her if she had eaten. She shook her head. I got up and made her a grilled cheese sandwich because that is what I made her when she was 8 years old and had a bad day at school. And some things don't change, and while the pan was heating up, I let her talk. She and my son-in-law Owen had been married for 6 years. The house they lived in was in a neighborhood called Millhaven, about 20 minutes from me, a three-bedroom craftsman with a front porch and a yard that Harriet had spent 2 summers turning into something beautiful. She'd planted a raised vegetable garden along the south fence. She'd refinished the porch boards herself one weekend in August on her hands and knees with a belt sander, came home to my house for Sunday dinner that evening with sawdust in her hair and a bruise on her knee, and she was so proud she practically glowed. The house had been purchased jointly, both names on the deed, both names on the mortgage. They put down $60,000, $35,000 from their savings, and $25,000 that Owen's mother Nadine had contributed as a gift. I remembered when Harriet told me about it. She'd seemed slightly uneasy even then, the way you feel when someone gives you something that seems generous but carries a weight you can't quite name. I told her to make sure it was documented as a gift, not a loan. She said Owen's mother had been very clear it was a gift, no strings attached. That had been 5 years ago. Now Nadine was claiming it was a loan. And because Owen had apparently decided the marriage was over, he hadn't told Harriet directly. There had been no conversation, no warning. Nadine had taken it upon herself to treat the situation as a business transaction. She'd had an attorney send the letter. She'd had Owen vacate the premises, or more likely she'd brought him to stay with her, and then she'd had the locks changed on a house where my daughter's name was on the deed. I put the plate in front of Harriet. She looked at the sandwich for a moment, then looked up at me, and her voice broke for the first time when she said, "She acted like I don't exist, like I'm just something to be removed." I put my hand over hers. I said, "Eat first." She ate. I sat with her and drank my coffee, and I let her finish, and then I cleared the plate and refilled my cup, and I sat back down, and I said, "Now tell me everything from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Here is what I should tell you about myself, because it matters. I am 63 years old. I have worked for the same company for 27 years, a mid-sized title insurance firm based out of Columbus, Ohio. I started as a processor, became a senior examiner, spent the last 11 years as the regional manager for claims and dispute resolution. What that means, in plain terms, is that I have spent the better part of 3 decades looking at property records, title chains, deeds, liens, and ownership disputes. I have seen people try to claim ownership of things that weren't theirs in every creative way imaginable. I have sat across tables from attorneys who were very confident and very wrong. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I know how property works in this state. I know what a deed means and what it doesn't mean. I know what a gift is and what a loan is and what the difference looks like on paper, and I know that a locked door does not determine who owns a house. I did not tell Harriet any of this that night. I just listened. She told me that the last few months with Owen had been difficult, distant, cold, full of silences she didn't know how to interpret. She'd suggested counseling twice. He'd agreed once and then canceled the appointment and never rescheduled. She'd come home a week ago to find him on the phone, and when she walked in, he'd left the room. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd been tired. She'd had a hard week at work. She did not know his mother had been involved until the note on the door. That part made me very still, because what it told me was that this had been planned. The lock change, the attorney letter, the note. Those things don't happen in an afternoon. Someone had consulted a lawyer. Someone had arranged for the locks to be changed by a licensed locksmith, which meant there was a paper trail. Someone had decided ahead of time how this was going to go, and they'd assumed Harriet would simply go along with it. I asked her one question before we went to bed that night. I said, "Do you have any documentation of that $25,000? Anything in writing?" She thought for a moment. Then she said Owen's mother had sent a check, and she thought she still had the deposit slip in her records. She also said, and this was the part that made me exhale slowly, that when they'd closed on the house, the title company had asked about the source of funds, and because it was over $10,000, they'd had to complete a gift letter. Signed by Nadine, notarized, on file with the title company. I said, "Good." She looked at me. "Good." I said, "Get some sleep. I'll explain tomorrow." She used my guest room. I sat up until almost midnight going over things in my mind, not because I was worried, but because I wanted to be sure I was thinking clearly. I wanted to be certain before I said anything. The next morning, I called in late to work. I told my assistant I'd be in by 11 and asked her to move my 9 o'clock. Then I drove to the title company that had handled the Mill Haven House closing. I recognized the name from the documents Harriet showed me. It was a company we'd worked with before on several commercial transactions. I didn't go there as a mother. I went there as a professional colleague asking for confirmation of a recorded document. The gift letter was on file, signed by Nadine, dated 5 years ago. The language was unambiguous. This money is given as a gift and is not expected to be repaid. There are no conditions attached to this gift. I made a copy. Then I drove back home and I sat down with Harriet at the breakfast table and I explained what we had. She had both names on the deed. That meant she was a co-owner of the property, not a tenant. Owen could not legally exclude her from the home. The locks being changed did not change who owned the house. It only changed who had a key, and that was a problem with a straightforward solution. The $25,000 from Nadine was documented as a gift, which meant it could not now be reclassified as a loan to create a financial claim against the property. Harriet listened to all of this very carefully. Then she said, "So what do I do?" I said, "First, we call a family law attorney. You need someone licensed who can file the right paperwork and represent you properly. What I know is the property side, the legal process itself. You need someone whose job that is." She nodded. I said, "Second, do not respond to that attorney letter on your own. Not one word. Not even to say you received it. Let your attorney do that." She nodded again. I said, "Third, and this is important, you haven't done anything wrong. You own half that house. You have the right to be there. Don't let them make you feel like a trespasser in your own property." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "How do you know all of this?" I said, 27 years is a long time to do anything." She laughed, a small, exhausted laugh, and I thought that was the best sound I'd heard in 2 days. I helped her find an attorney that afternoon. Her name was Sandra Bouchard. She had 20 years in family law and had handled several cases that involved property disputes within divorces. She was recommended by a colleague of mine who had used her firm for a commercial matter and spoken highly of the partner group. Harriet called that same day and got an appointment for Thursday morning. I drove her there. I sat in the waiting room while Harriet met with Sandra, and I will tell you that I have sat in a great many waiting rooms in my life, and I have never once been as focused as I was in that one. I was going through everything I knew, making sure I hadn't missed anything, making sure the information I'd given my daughter was accurate and complete. Because there is a difference between knowing your field and being someone's mother, and when the two overlap, you have to be twice as careful, because the stakes are not abstract. Sandra came out to get me about 40 minutes into the appointment. She shook my hand and asked me to come back in, and she said she had a few questions about the title documentation. I answered them. At the end of the meeting, Sandra laid out the path clearly. She would file to enjoin Owen from continuing to deny Harriet access to the marital property. She would respond to Nadine's attorney's letter with a request for the legal basis of any claimed interest in the property, which, given the gift letter, would be very difficult to establish, and she would begin the divorce proceedings with a full accounting of marital assets, including the equity in the Millhaven house. She told Harriet that her position was strong. She said it without drama, the way good professionals do, not to be reassuring, but because it was simply true. What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the way people might expect. There was no confrontation in a parking lot. There was no screaming. Nadine's attorney sent 2 more letters, increasingly strained in tone, attempting to assert that the $25,000 had been given under an informal agreement of repayment. Sandra responded to each one with a copy of the notarized gift letter and a request for any documented evidence of the alleged repayment agreement. There was no such document. There could not be, because no such agreement had ever existed. Harriet was granted a court order allowing her access to the property. She went back on a Saturday morning with a sheriff's deputy present, as the order specified, and she walked through the front door of her own home, and she stood in the kitchen she had chosen the cabinets for, and she stood on the back porch that looked out over the garden she had built, and she called me afterward, and I could hear in her voice that something had shifted. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that sounded like solid ground. Owen, through his attorney, eventually agreed to a buyout arrangement rather than a contested sale. The equity in the house had grown considerably since the purchase. The neighborhood had appreciated, and Harriet had put real work into the property. The final settlement gave her a number that covered her legal fees, her moving costs, and a down payment on a place of her own. Nadine's claim was dismissed. I don't know exactly when Nadine understood what she was dealing with. I was not in the room for any of the legal proceedings. That was Sandra's domain, and I stayed in mine. But I know that at some point the letters stopped, the pressure stopped, and whatever plan had been assembled on that Tuesday evening when my daughter found a note on her door began to unravel at the edges. Plans like that depend on the other person not knowing what they're entitled to. Harriet is in her own apartment now, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood she loves, with good light and a small balcony where she's already started container gardening. She talks about it the way she used to talk about the Millhaven porch, with that particular brightness people have when they're building something that's genuinely theirs. She told me recently that the thing she keeps coming back to is that note on the door. Not with anger, she said, just with a kind of clarity, because that note had assumed she was alone. It had assumed there was no one standing behind her, no one who understood the system well enough to navigate it, no one who would show up and say, "We're not going to let this happen." She said they picked a wrong family to do that to. I said I wasn't sure it was about being the right or wrong family. I said most people, if they know what they're entitled to, if they have documentation, if they find the right help, most people can fight this. The system isn't always friendly, but it has rules, and the rules are written down, and that matters. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like something you should say in a video. I'm not used to taking directions from my daughter." But on that one, I think she was right. If you're watching this and you're in a situation where someone is using paperwork or money or legal sounding language to make you feel like you have no options, please do not assume they're correct. Please talk to someone who knows the specific type of law involved. Please gather your documents before you need them. A gift letter, a deed, a deposit record, a text message. These things matter. They're the difference between what someone claims and what can actually be proven. You are not a trespasser in your own life, and if someone has made you feel like you are, the first thing to do is find out exactly what you're entitled to, because you might be surprised. I've thought about that Tuesday evening a lot since everything's settled. The way Harriet stood on my porch with that rolling suitcase, wearing a blazer that was too big for her now, her eyes dry because she'd already run out of tears somewhere between her car and my front door. I've thought about what would have happened if she had gone somewhere else that night. If she'd gone to a friend's apartment, or checked into a hotel, or simply believed what that note on the door was designed to make her believe, that the situation was already decided, that the house was already lost, that she had no ground left to stand on. That's what the note was counting on, not the law. The feeling. There's something I've come to understand over a long career of watching people navigate systems they didn't build and didn't fully understand. The people who take advantage of others in moments of crisis, and I've seen it in property disputes, in estate fights, in situations far messier than Harriet's. They are rarely smarter than the person they're targeting. They are almost always just faster. They move first. They use language that sounds official. They create a sense of finality before the other person has had a moment to breathe. And if the other person panics, if they retreat, if they accept the framing they've been handed, then the strategy works. Not because it was right, because it went unchallenged. Harriet didn't panic. I don't want to take credit for that. She walks through my door already steadier than she knew. She ate the sandwich. She told me everything clearly and in order. She asked good questions. That's not nothing. That's someone who, even in the worst moment, kept enough of herself together to be present for what came next. What I gave her was information, and an attorney, and a copy of a document that someone had signed 5 years ago thinking it would never matter. It mattered. I think about the choices that led to that document existing. Harriet's small unease when the money was offered. My suggestion, offhand at a Sunday dinner, make sure it's in writing. A title company doing its job thoroughly at closing. None of those felt like significant moments at the time. They were just careful habits, the kind you build so slowly you forget you have them. But they accumulated, and when they were needed, they were there. That's what I want people to take from this. Not that you need to know everything, not that you need to be an expert in property law or have a specific career or have the right connections. What you need is the habit of carefulness, of keeping records, of asking before you need to, "What would I do if this went wrong?" Of not assuming that because someone is family, the paperwork doesn't matter. It always matters. Documents don't replace trust, but they protect you when trust turns out to have been misplaced. Owen's mother believed she could rewrite what had happened because nothing was stopping her. She was wrong. The stopping thing already existed. It had been sitting in a file at a title company for 5 years, patient and exact. Harriet has a balcony now, with containers of tomatoes and herbs coming in. She called me last week just to tell me the basil was doing well. I told her that was very important news. She laughed. That sound, easy, unguarded, like she used to laugh when she was young, that is the sound of solid ground.